For this video, we will be talking about the Age of Enlightenment, and I recommend that you pull up the PowerPoint for that so that you can follow along and take notes. The Age of Enlightenment, also called the Age of Reason, is going to shape Western Europe and the Western world probably more than any other real phenomenon in this period of history. The Age of Enlightenment was really a shift that's going to happen with regards to the intellectual perspective of the world, as well as a combating against an absolute form of government and the rise of democracy or democratic types of ideas. So, to get a little bit of a base, we need to understand a little bit about absolutism. We'll be talking more about this in our next module. But absolutism is a form of government where the king has complete power. All power within the nation is wrapped up in the king. And absolutism is going to reach her height in France under the rule of King Louis XIV, who nicknamed himself the Sun King. He literally said that I am the state, meaning that he is all that is France and France is all that is him. He was not accountable to the people. He was not accountable to any other kind of legislative branch, such as a parliament, or in France at this time, it would have been the Estates General. The rule of this absolute king was despotic. He spent a ton of money, fought in a lot of wars, and taxed the lower classes quite heavily. And so the Enlightenment is going to begin, ironically, one of her places she begins is in France, as a kind of pushback against this absolute form of government. There's our King Louis, the Sun King. So the basis for the Enlightenment is going to be centered in several areas. One of those is, again, going back to the idea of humanism, the focus on the human, that humans are able to progress or humans are able to create some kind of progress in their lives. And that really stems some from the Renaissance. The scientific revolution, again, moved humans up to the forefront once again with regards to the worldview of the people and what humans would be able to achieve and what they could discover. And then this idea of natural law, that there are laws that govern the universe and that govern our world. And so it's only natural to believe that there are laws that govern societies and peoples. And so all of this becomes a base for the Enlightenment. And so we then move into the definition of what is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, in its essence, is an intellectual development that is going to shape the 17th century. It is going to be based on several different key ideas or key beliefs. These include things such as against religious intolerance, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which will go along with that, against the arbitrary arrest of people, laws that would be applicable to everybody, not just the lower classes. The ideas that things that stifled free thought should be removed from society. All of these become kind of the undercurrent and the base for the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment began in Paris, but really is going to have a little, if you look on your center of Enlightenment map here, you can see a little triangle. London, Amsterdam, and Paris becomes kind of the center point of the developments of the Enlightenment. And it was centered around individuals who are called philosophers. Philosophers were literary people. They tended to be more of your middle class people. They were economists. They were social justice types of individuals who really focused on these ideas of the rights of humankind. The Enlightenment is going to heavily affect England and obviously America as well. The place where our philosophers would often meet were in salons. Salons became these kind of sometimes impromptu, but often scheduled events where individuals, intellects, and writers and thinkers throughout various categories of society would come together and they would discuss these ideas. Usually, women would host the salon, and it would be a time to really get deep about some of the concepts and ideas that were floating around at this time, as well as begin to create a new form of challenge to the absolutism of the day. The father of the Enlightenment is Voltaire. He was French and he went to England in his young adult life and was heavily influenced by the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press that was allowed there. And so he brought some of those ideas back with him. And he began to write against the religious intolerance of France and the royal absolutism. In France at this time, there was only one religion, and it was the Catholic Church that was the power. Protestantism, which is another form within Christianity, wasn't even really tolerated in most of France at this time. So Voltaire began to write against the intolerance that was there in place. He argued that the death penalty needed to end, that torture needed to end. He was for social reform, he was for individual rights. His famous work was Treatise on Toleration, where he addressed this issue of religious intolerance, especially because he writes so strongly against some aspects or most aspects of the French government. He is going to be put in danger and he will have to flee France on several different occasions. Montesquieu is another one of our Enlightenment philosophers, and his most famous work is The Spirit of the Laws. And in this, he is going to put forth the idea that there are several different types of governments that should be allowed or are allowed to exist, the despotic, the monarchy, and then the republic. And he's going to argue that the republic is the better form of government because it allows for a separation of powers and for checks and balances between those powers. He criticized the French government because of the merging of the monarchy with the church, as well as having all power in one individual. And under the spirit of the laws, the idea that the government would be spread out amongst several branches is going to be written about and highly favored in the newly forming American government that will be happening here. Diderot is another one of our philosophers. He went so far with his religious tolerance to actually become intolerant, and he condemned Christianity, which was unusual in this period of history. He is going to become the co editor of the encyclopedia, and the encyclopedia becomes a place to put information, the ideas of the Enlightenment, as well as just some basic types of ways to better society all in one place. He will alphabetize this. He works with several other people, but he'll alphabetize this rather than have what would be deemed important by the wealthy at the front part of the book. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is another one of our philosophers, and his view of nature is that people needed to rely more on their emotion than on reason. In this way, he was a little bit different than the other Enlightenment philosophers who focused much more on reason. He is going to argue that the ideal type of society has no ruler and no aristocracy, and the people freely give up their rights to the consent of the whole, to the consent of the majority. And he'll write about this in the social contract. It is the idea that a government, or excuse me, a society is agreeing to be governed by the general will, not necessarily just to follow the individual will. Adam Smith is another one of our philosophers. His most famous work is The Wealth of Nations. He is going to lay out new types of ideas with regards to the economy, the law of supply and demand, which is a base of capitalism, laissez-faire, which means the government is not involved in the economy, the law of competition between markets, free markets. All of this lays the groundwork for capitalism, private ownership of property. These ideas were put forth by Adam Smith, and of course, they will be adopted here in America early on. During the Enlightenment, reading is going to go up quite a bit. The literacy rate is going to go up, and more people will have access to books, which is going to lead us to a new level of intellectual development as well. Women played an interesting role. Many of them ran the salons, and Madame Pompadour, who was the mistress of King Louis XV, is really going to promote the Enlightenment. She was highly educated. She's going to promote for a better education for women. Women were behind the publication of the encyclopedia as well. And so, in all of this, you will see an undercurrent of the role of women helping push the ideas of the Enlightenment forward. Some key terms of the Enlightenment. These terms really wrap up what the Enlightenment entails. Reason means that humans are able to solve their problems through their own reasoning capability. And what they're basically saying with this is they don't really need God. Atheism is not going to really be born as a movement yet, but the atheist movement is beginning to have a little bit of kind of development happening here as the emphasis is moved away from God onto humans, eventually to the point of removing any kind of God from the equation. The idea of nature here is that the natural world has laws, and therefore society has laws in place as well. The idea of the human nature, the development of sociology will become part of this as well. The idea of happiness, that people should be free to pursue their own happiness, is a new idea. And that idea of happiness is that it should be pursued here on earth rather than in heaven or in the eternal. And this is a shift in the Western world. It's obviously not going to be complete, but it is a change, and it becomes an idea of the Enlightenment. The idea of progress, that humans can get better and that societies can get better. This was a new idea. And the ideas of freedom, liberty, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of individuals, all of this becomes a key part of the Enlightenment. Now, one of the things that the Enlightenment is going to do is it's going to give birth to this new movement called deism. Deism is the idea that God created everything but is no longer in the world. He put everything in place and kind of wound it up and now has stepped back. And with this, we will see a movement of Christian response. Deism is not Christian in its essence. And so, one of the key parts of the movement here is with John Wesley. Wesley will be the founder of the Methodist Church, and the Methodist Church is going to focus on several things. One of those is God's daily activity in people's lives, to create them into people that He can dwell in and that are holy. And then the other part of this is the idea of the social gospel, to care for the poor, to care for those that are disenfranchised. Consequences and impact of the Enlightenment challenged the ideas about society. It challenged divine right. It challenged the Catholic Church. It's going to put in motion the American and French revolutions. And it's going to develop these ideas of materialism, that humans are just machines, that God is a product of the human mind, that people only need reason to live in the world. Now, not everyone is going to follow these ideas of the Enlightenment, but they become a kind of stream that are going to move forward the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and also going to really shape the 20th century of the Western world.